Well, welcome everyone to this CIMR policy debate, which promises to be an extremely interesting one. We're going to focus on the new book by Cecilia Rikap and Bengt-Ake Lundvall, The Digital Innovation Race. The subtitle is Conceptualizing the Emerging New World Order, a very prescient and relevant title for the present times. The format will be that Cecilia will speak for about 25 minutes, then Daniele Archibugi will comment for about 10 minutes. Let me briefly introduce them. Cecilia is a lecturer in international political economy at City University London. She's also associated with the Argentine Research Council and with the COSTEC lab at the University of Compiègne in northern France. She's published very widely articles on a range of topics related to innovation and knowledge accumulation, and two important books. The first is published fairly recently, Capitalism, Power and Innovation, published with Routledge, which is about the use of intellectual accumulation strategies and monopolization in large firms. And the second, the book which we have to discuss today, The Digital Innovation Race, deals with the emerging new world order, deals with the use of knowledge and specifically AI algorithms in accumulation strategies and competitive strategies by very large digitally focused firms. Daniele Archibugi is well known to all of you, I think, as a theorist of innovation, and he also has written extensively about digital and other leading technologies such as biotech. Given that Cecilia's focus with Bengt-Ake in this book is largely about a struggle for world control in technology, it's worth mentioning, I think, that Daniele has a second string to his bow. He's not just an innovation theorist, he's also a political scientist, especially looking at international issues. He was one of those who developed the concept of cosmopolitan democracy. And his book, The Global Commonwealth of Citizens, is largely to do with the governance of public goods on a global scale, and I think is very relevant to the topic we're dealing with today. Okay, so with that, I hand over to Cecilia, and after Cecilia and Daniele have spoken, we'll have questions and discussion, and I'll say a few words later about the mechanics of how to do that. So, Cecilia, welcome.
Thank you, Keith. Thanks all of you, Marion, and all of you there participating in this session. I will start by sharing my screen. So now you should be able to see my first slide with the cover of the book on the left-hand side. As it was already said, this is a co-authored book. Professor Lundvall couldn't be here today, and I will try to guide you through the content of the book and starting precisely by a pressing question that is not only about the focus of this book, but at the same time is a question that has been quite an inspiration for us in terms of writing and thinking about this book. And this deals with some stylized facts and what's going on with contemporary capitalism, in particular with the leading corporations and the this big question deals precisely with whether there is something that these big companies have in common. They come from different industries and different backgrounds and different countries, although widely concentrated in the US. But is there anything that they have in common? And what can be seen through different stylized facts is that these companies are concentrating most of the profits. So a small share of companies concentrating a larger and larger share of corporate profits. And in particular, that these companies that are profiting the most are companies that are intensive in intangible assets, and among them, they are highly related to digitally intensive sectors. And we have a several set of indicators or stylized facts that point to this. For instance, the share of intangibles and tangible assets in the largest firms that are nowadays in the index of Standard & Poor's 500, but we can also think, for instance, in terms of the business expenditure and R&D and identify how the largest companies investing the most in business expenditure and R&D are also highly concentrating the what are called as, for instance, IP5 patents, which are inventions that have been patented in the 5 largest patent offices. And another relevant stylized fact for this book is the sectoral concentration in terms of both business expenditure on R&D, so inputs for potential new innovations based on science and technology, but also this is seen at the level of outputs such as intellectual property rights from different types. And in particular, within this sectoral concentration, ICT, both in terms of digital services, but also devices, stands out. And it is within this context that what the book attempts to do in order to provide a conceptualization of big tech companies. So we're not trying to explain the emergence of every single platform company or of the platform economy, but actually trying to understand the emergence of big tech companies from the US and from China. And to do so, we identify that these companies have some features that are in common with other leading corporations from other sectors that lead us to think of them as intellectual monopolies. But intellectual monopolies doesn't mean only, or even not necessarily, a concentration of patents or a concentration of intellectual property rights, but actually a process where the same firm is relying on a permanent and expanding monopoly over portions of society's knowledge that it transforms into intangible assets. And what we try to explain in the book is how big tech companies are appropriating both knowledge and data. And when we refer to knowledge and data appropriation, we map things like this. For some of you, perhaps quite a strange mapping, which is a network analysis output. I will come back to this later on, but this is basically a way in which we try to map what afterwards I will define as a corporate innovation system. And it's a way of identifying that we have several organizations participating in the innovation process, building new knowledge, although we end up having just a few corporations transforming that knowledge into intangible assets and therefore capturing earnings from innovation. And this inequality, we try to explain it as transformation of what was supposed to be a temporary into a permanent advantage. We all know that in principle, the firm that innovates will have an extraordinary profit. And in principle, again, at some point, we, and when I say we, I say the economics literature, the business literature from different schools of thought, we all assume that, and we have been assuming until now, that at some point diffusion would take place, and therefore this advantage of the innovator would disappear. And it can be driven by different factors, but ultimately there is always this idea of one firm innovating and that process at some point vanishing, either by the adoption of this new technology or by another firm that innovates and leapfrogs and becomes the new knowledge frontier. What we see and why we speak of intellectual monopolies is because we see firms that are constantly winning the innovation race. And the diffusion process is never taking place fully. There's never a process where the industry is again altogether at the knowledge frontier or where some other firm outpaces the leader, but leading corporations of contemporary capitalism, what we try to explain is that they have become the constant leaders of the digital innovation race. And I will come of the innovation race in general, and in particular, big tech of the digital innovation race. And I will come back to this with more details in 1 second. But let me emphasize that when we speak of intellectual monopolies, it's not only the concentration of intellectual property rights. And in the tech sector, this is extremely important. If you think, for instance, of secrecy, how big data, how also the search engines are kept secret. And just one clarification, when we speak of intellectual monopolies, we're not saying that these companies are market monopolies. In fact, what we also try to map is how for these firms that become intellectual monopolies, in many cases, it's a better strategy to subordinate rivals and make them participate in what part of the literature has called, for instance, ecosystems, and produce what are supposed to be just complementary products. But although the products are complementary, there is a hierarchy or an asymmetric relationship between the company holding the intellectual monopoly and these other subordinate companies that leads to an unequal distribution of the value that is produced in that ecosystem. So how come we ended up in this context, and why big tech and digital technologies are so important? The first thing, for those of you that work on innovation studies, is all this must be quite obvious, but just as a reminder, we produce knowledge on the basis of existing knowledge, but that doesn't mean that we are all equally prepared to produce and absorb knowledge. And the concept of absorptive capacity is key for understanding firms' technological differentiation. Because if we think that there is a firm that has innovated and therefore it's at the knowledge and innovated to the world, being at the knowledge frontier, if it decides to reinvest part of these extraordinary profits in more R&D, in more potential innovations, and it's successful again before the rest manage to catch up, it will keep expanding the knowledge frontier and remain always with the maximum absorptive capacity in comparison with the rest. And therefore, the chances of this successful firm to keep producing new successes will be expanding as it innovates more and more. At the same time, if we complement the idea of absorptive capacities with management capacities, with this capacity to transform new knowledge and process data into effective innovations, those organizations with the largest absorptive and management capacities will develop a form of self-reinforcing their intellectual monopolies. If we complement this with the higher cost of doing R&D and also with recent technological changes, and in particular, we can even go to the first phase of the ICT revolution, where since we have internet, for a company that is at the knowledge frontier with the maximum absorptive capacities, it only takes a couple of clicks to find out the new developments within the fields of its interest. And it will already have the absorptive capacities to transform that and the management capacities to transform that into successful innovations, which again will be reinforcing intellectual monopolization. At the same time, these technological changes have favored the process of dividing or outsourcing the innovation process in different parts, and these parts can take place at any part of the world, which means that the companies with the largest innovative capacities will also be able to outsource these steps in not only startup companies and other innovating firms, but also in universities and public research organizations that are that have the experts on each specific topic. And this form of knowledge modularity would also be a fertile ground for further innovation. But of course, we cannot think of intellectual monopoly capitalism and the emergence in particular of big tech firms without understanding that this process has taken place not just in terms of what can be considered as purely economic or as the effect of economic and technological transformations, but also relies strongly on institutional and political transformations. And here you have a whole set that I will not have time to go in detail into it, but let me just say in terms of the emergence of an international intellectual property rights regime, that this is a quite long process. We are used to refer in particular from the changes starting from the 1980s onwards, in particular to transformations inside the US, such as the Bayh-Dole Act, which enable those that had innovated using public funds to patent those results. And then we typically speak of TRIPS as the moment, the agreement at the international level that transferred or translated the United States intellectual property right regime to the rest of the world, or part of the rest of the world, because in principle, at least initially, China did not comply with TRIPS. But if we want actually to trace the history of this intellectual property rights regime, we even need to go back to at least the end of the 19th century with a first disembodiment or detachment process where the employee stopped being the owner of the product of its knowledge products, of the workplace knowledge, and it became the property of the firm. And after this first detachment process, where innovation started being considered as something embedded mostly in machines, we arrive at a second disembodiment process or moment from the 1980s onwards, where we can conceptualize it very simply as the separation between software and hardware. Although this doesn't apply exactly like this to every single sector, what I'm trying to explain here is the process where knowledge stops being just embedded in the machine, but starts being as a form of immaterial or intangible assets for the firm. And in this context, let me say one more word about policies. Since the 70s onwards, even if there is, of course, an emergence of neoliberalism in the United States, and that refers to a change in the role of the state, among this change of the role of the state, what has not been accepted so straightforwardly, but more and more there are research that show that the United States has always conducted industrial policy, but this was hidden, and in particular industrial policy in the sense of science, technology, and innovation policy related or connected with military aims was key for the United States, initially in its fight against the USSR, afterwards trying to limit Japan's catching up, and nowadays it is also central when we think of the relations, the not only the technological war, but the different forms of struggles or confrontations with China. So it is in this context that AI appears as a strategic technology for the governments and at a geopolitical level, and also appears as a key resource for contemporary capitalism. But just one small word on why we shouldn't just misleadingly compare data to raw oil, that will even show us why AI is so strategic and why AI coupled with data are the key technologies of our time. Unlike oil, we know that data is non-rival, but there is something even more important, which is that the artificial intelligence algorithms that are widely used nowadays, which are machine learning algorithms, in particular deep learning algorithms, are algorithms that learn, that get better the more they are used. So the more data is processed with the same AI model, the better it will get. It will self-adjust by itself. If we think in terms of means of production, it will be like saying that this is a machine that gets better the more we use it. So the AI algorithm is a means of production that is constantly improving. So in a way, we can think of a process of continuous innovation the more data is processed. And now we can see why big tech are perhaps the most paradigmatic and extreme example of these intellectual monopolies I was speaking of. If we think in terms of data concentrated by big tech companies, of course, we don't have indicators measuring data concentration at the firm level, but we have some proxies in terms of, for instance, the surface of these companies' data centers, the growth of the surface of these companies' data centers, and also some proxies that I have made at different moments for different papers and for the book, where we see a growing concentration of data in the hands of big tech, in particular in the hands of those big techs that are operating the cloud. And I will come back to the cloud later on, but let me say that it's not only that these companies are concentrating data, they are also concentrating the most advanced AI algorithms in these technologies that I was describing just a minute ago. And here you can see the result of a text mining analysis from the scientific publications of chosen big tech companies. In green, you can see keywords related to machine learning, deep neural networks. In yellow, you can see the functional applications of AI. And in blue, you can see terms related to data. Let me just emphasize for those of you that are not familiarized with this technique that this is not that Lundvall and I chose these words and made the list. This is the output of an automatic process that analyzed all the abstracts, keywords, and titles of these company scientific publications, and as a result, listed the terms that appeared with the highest frequency. And this is what you're seeing here. So you're seeing here that although these companies come from different backgrounds and participate in different markets, they are, in terms of technology, we see high technological conversions, and this convergence is around AI and big data. This is why we think of tech giants actually as data-driven intellectual monopolies, because what they're eventually monopolizing is even a new way of innovating, a new method of innovation, innovating by processing data with machine learning. And this process not only continuously adjusts the algorithm and therefore improves these companies' ongoing businesses, but also opens new avenues or new potential markets. In fact, big tech companies, we can think of their expansionary strategy as both widening and deepening. They are entering new sectors, and they are doing so on the basis of their already dominance in AI, as well as in data, in using their already harvested data, for instance, to enter the healthcare sector. And if you're interested in this topic, I can further develop some examples during the Q&A. And they are also deepening their monopolization of more general artificial intelligence through their clouds. And here we see also a highly concentrated market, not only companies concentrating technologies, but also a highly concentrated market with Amazon, Microsoft, and Google concentrating around 65% of the market. And if we add Alibaba, we have around 70% of this market. So why is the cloud so important? Well, because the cloud also challenges the way we think about the relevance of being a user of a technology. In the cloud, companies that access services provided by Amazon, by Microsoft, by Google, access those services as black boxes. For instance, let's say that there is a company that wants to develop a specific application that includes facial recognition. They will get a button, they will get a black box that provides facial recognition that has already been programmed by, for instance, let's say Amazon Web Services, but as much as they will be using the technology, they will never be accessing this technology. There is no way of doing reverse engineering or opening that black box. And therefore, the cloud ends up limiting the chances of learning by doing, using, and interacting, and it also risks to perpetuate technological dependence, not only from companies from other sectors, but also even other platform companies like Netflix or Uber and others that rely and that cannot work without the cloud provided by this few big tech. But I've been speaking a lot about these companies as the leaders in terms of innovation. What I have not said enough, I only briefly mentioned it at one point, is that all this leading innovation is not being exclusively done inside these companies, in-house by their in-house R&D laboratories. Precisely what we observed in our book with Lundvall and in our papers and so on, is that there is a process of knowledge appropriation, because these intellectual monopolies, in particular big tech companies, organize what we have defined as corporate innovation systems. And as other innovation systems, here we see several organizations participating and producing the innovation together. However, the innovation system is organized and controlled by the intellectual monopoly. And by doing so, the intellectual monopoly defines the general R&D orientations. Of course, it cannot anticipate every single step, and there are degrees of autonomy, but the general orientations, who's doing what, and the evolution of this corporate innovation system will be in the hands of the intellectual monopoly. And again, because of this privileged position, the intellectual monopoly will be harvesting most of the associated rents, and this is why we speak of knowledge predation, and this leads to higher polarization at multiple levels. So in our book, we provide some evidence of the content of big tech companies' corporate innovation systems. We see that they are global, and we also see that as much as we've been discussing in general about decoupling between the US and China, these companies also rely on research being conducted in each other's countries. So US companies relying on Chinese research and the other way around. And even companies like Alibaba and Tencent have AI laboratories in the US. Microsoft has also AI laboratories in China and so on. But as much as these corporate innovation systems are global, they are global, but at the same time rely on national innovation systems, and in particular rely on the leading organizations of their respective countries that are also geographically quite close to these companies. See, for instance, how the top co-author of Google, Amazon, and Microsoft scientific publications is always the University of California. Interesting also to see that these companies are not just competing for technology, but also collaborate for technology, as we can see Microsoft as Amazon's second co-author and also third Google's co-author. So these companies establish competition for certain steps of their technological processes, but also collaborate for other steps. There's a lot more to say about this table, but let me just move on to provide you some insights on how we measure this idea of knowledge appropriation. And we do it by comparing co-authorships, which you have them here, with co-ownership of patents. Of course, not all the research that these companies organize in their corporate innovation systems is afterwards patented. I've been speaking before about secrecy, for instance. But these are the indicators that are available for us, and they are quite shocking when we identify the high degree of co-authorships and the almost inexistent co-ownerships of patents that deal, and this is another thing that we do in the book, that deal with same topics. So it shouldn't be a surprise that this is the geography of digital intellectual monopoly capitalism, where Chinese and US companies are concentrating most of the market capitalization when we think of platform companies. And they're also concentrating and appropriating not only value, but also knowledge, also data, and also resources from, among others, least developed countries. Interesting things also refer to how other companies from different sectors, such as BlackRock or big pharma companies, are also trying to become data-driven intellectual monopolies. So base more their innovations on analyzing data with artificial intelligence. But before concluding, let me just go back to one of the aims of this book, which is not only to speak about US and Chinese big tech, but also to understand how their emergence can only be understood as a co-evolution of corporate and political powers by also looking at the US and the Chinese state role in this process. So on the one hand, big tech from the US and China, as I have just shown you, have built their strength in AI precisely based on R&D of their home countries, universities, and public research organizations, often funded by their respective states. I also briefly refer to the US, not this is it should say US, not EU, but it's the US hidden industrial policy. And in the case of China, I didn't refer to it before, but there are a whole set of policies, protectionist policies, including the Great Firewall, but many others as well that we describe in the book, that show how the Chinese state was essential for building, among others, the infrastructure and the space for Chinese tech giants to emerge, and not only to emerge inside China, but also we can speak of to some extent, a state-driven imperialism, because the digital Silk Road within the Belt and Road Initiative has been essential for the expansion of Alibaba, Tencent, and Huawei. Without digital infrastructure, these companies cannot operate, and part of the Belt and Road Initiative included expanding internet and providing internet access to less developed countries. But at the same time, the US and the Chinese state depend on their own companies' success, not only geopolitically speaking, but also even for their everyday activities. The challenge is that these companies are policymakers, and they are policymakers at two levels. On the one hand, they sit on the advisory boards of their states, and they provide constant advices on, for instance, how the US should be investing on more and more AI. The US state should be investing more on AI, and the way big tech companies justify this need for more investment is precisely by saying that otherwise China will outpace the US. So these companies are also completely within the struggles between the US and China and playing a role in fostering this divide. But at the same time, they're policymakers of their own, what can be even called as their own republic, making decisions every day on what should happen or what cannot happen in their platforms. And therefore, this juxtaposition of policy spheres opens questions on who's making the rules or whether we are ruled by law or by algorithms. So just to give you an example, just remember what happened when Jack Ma's Ant Group was going to go for an IPO in Shanghai. And at that moment, the Chinese state identified that these companies had too much power and decided to cancel Ant Group's IPO. And that led to a whole set of attempts of regulating these companies. So it's quite challenging to identify to what extent these states will effectively regulate their own companies because of the dependencies I was speaking before. So just to conclude, intellectual monopolies are taking over states' functions, as I have just said, and but at the same time, they reinforce their own states' hegemonies. So these two dimensions lead to clashes of power. And among those clashes of power, we can also rethink of the US and China trade war as a tech conflict, a conflict where we see this tension between techno-nationalisms and global intellectual monopolies. And one may wonder, what's the role of Europe? What's the role of the rest of the world in this context? In terms of what is to be done, and just without attempting to provide a definitive answer, but just opening up more questions to all of you and to keep on reflecting on this, what we see is that just science, technology, and innovation policies are not enough. They may end up favoring those that can harvest the successful outcomes of that process. So the already big tech winners in this sector and intellectual monopolies from other sectors. That market regulations are also quite ill-equipped because these companies are not only, in many cases, market gatekeepers, but also knowledge and information gatekeepers. So we could envision a new common knowledge regime with also public and free education. We could envision public natural monopolies, but all this, for the moment, seems quite unfeasible. And more feasible solutions could be, for instance, pushing for automatic waivers for knowledge that could alleviate social, health, or ecological hardships, think of specific agendas for peripheral countries, and also try to elaborate on more local or city-based alternatives. And finally, taxing needs to be a huge part of this discussion. These companies are not only the most powerful companies in the world, the ones that are concentrating the largest market capitalization and so on. They are also among those that pay the lowest corporate taxes in terms of tax rates. And since these companies also end up planning and organizing portions of society, there is also an open question to think of a recovery plan that covers multiple dimensions, and that instead of being driven by the desires of big companies, can actually be built on tackling major social, ecological, political, and economic issues for humanity. So thanks a lot. I'm sorry if I spoke for a bit more than what was expected, and I'm open to Daniele's comments and discussing with all of you.
Cecilia, thank you very much. You have gone on a bit longer than planned, but only by 1 minute, so that's very good. Very stimulating and interesting presentation. Thank you very much. Let's go straight on without further ado to Daniele. Daniele, what is your response?
Yeah, thank you very much, Keith. Thank you very much, Cecilia. I'm trying to upload my slides as suggested by Marion. Here we are. Can you see them?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So, I mean, the presentation is very, very rich. It has quite a lot of different themes to be addressed. And I would say it's a brave program, assertive. If I can say something more, is something which from Buenos Aires, it seems very much the Buenos Aires style, but I very much appreciate this attempt. So what are my points? First of all, the connection between nations on the one hand and companies on the other hand. It's quite clear that what nations do in high technologies is strongly associated to the availability of companies. And if you are not American and you are not Chinese, you somehow start to be worried. As somebody trained in economics, I would say that the term intellectual monopoly is appropriate for the first word, less appropriate for the second word, in the sense that what you are shown is that we are really dealing with a restricted oligopoly. It's a restricted oligopoly of companies which do so many things. And actually, I found very interesting the evidence you provide, in which you really show that on the one hand, these companies are entering into a variety of different business lines, competing among each other. I'm not sure if this is one of the slides that you dropped, but the fact that you really see that they are not so much focusing each of them on one field. And when they're there, they try to exploit the technical expertise in a variety of different fields. And therefore, there is a certain amount of competition. I also find very interesting what you have shown, namely that, as is often the case, oligopolistic companies also collaborate among themselves. And actually, when you see the evidence you provided on the scientific publications, which we can assume are the parts of knowledge which is more likely to be public knowledge and in which companies are willing to share for free, you really see that companies are not just working with public sectors, universities, and other things, but they're even working among themselves. And that, by the way, I noted that one traditional company, which is not generally considered in the big tech, namely IBM, is quite crucial by collaborating with quite a few of the new entries. So I think that we need very much to develop a theory applied to the new framework, which tries to associate governments and companies. We go back to Susan Strange, rival companies, rival nations. And this is particularly relevant for the countries and the geographic areas, including Europe, mostly Europe, which are not there. We are totally squeezed at the moment, you know? And if we look at data processing, mobile telephones, computers, and so on, so what is still the key dominant factor, you really see that the struggle is more and more between United States and Japan, and Europe is just watching at the window, and that indeed is something which somehow, if you are a European, might be worrying, but might be worrying also if for any reason you start to be outside the Western world. And I already said that. Now I go to something on which I challenge you, and also I challenge my colleagues at Birkbeck, because at Birkbeck we have a group of excellence working on industry university relationships, and Helen, Marion, Federica, Mutu, you know, so we've got a rather large team of colleagues working on that. The implicit assumption of the research carried out in this field is that we need to have more collaboration, not less. And basically, we assume that universities should not close into the ivory tower, but directly or indirectly, they also need to be associated with the business sector, often with small companies. The Oxford phenomenon studied by Ellen, the Cambridge phenomenon studied by others, and so on, not necessarily with the large corporations only, but indeed that there is a basis for university to link with companies. By the way, recent research has shown something which I think is quite interesting, that the recent Nobel Prize winners in chemistry, physics, and medicine, all of them start to have companies. And therefore, they make money, not just because they produce public knowledge, but also because somehow they associate this public knowledge to some businesses. None of them is as rich as Bill Gates or Bezos, unfortunately, but somehow, we might somehow be even a bit pleased that to make a bit of money out of our academic knowledge is not entirely ruled out. So at the end of the day, and that I call also my colleagues into the discussion, do we have some guidelines to say when it's good to be in a collaboration with industry or not? Because at the end, we provide policy advice to our universities, to the governments on these sort of issues, and to what extent these sort of things are somehow relevant. Finally, I would like to challenge you on the policy aspects, because I'm convinced, for example, that Europe needs to address these issues. And so far, Europe is addressing these issues in many ways, some of them relevant, but perhaps not in the decisive way. Because we are accepting that there are the monopolies, these restricted American Chinese oligopoly, but we do not try to enter. And when we promote public policies, these public policies are open to everybody. For example, the European framework programs are open to all companies, including the European subsidiaries of American corporations, for example. Do we really need to do something more in order to enter into the business? And even if you take into account the enormous amount of public money which is now put into the pipeline through Next Generation Europe, a massive program, a really massive program, you see that these resources are vehiculated through national governments, are not vehiculated through some European joint ventures. The work which, by the way, was also discussed in one of our seminars, I suggest that we need to move towards the European public corporations in high-tech sectors. And indeed, this is not what's happening. And therefore, I would like to use this occasion to challenge you also on these ideas. Last issue, and I finish here, you rightly mentioned the fact that this restricted oligopoly is self-reinforcing. This is true, of course, but I would also note that it's self-reinforcing in as much as we move towards a given technological trajectory. And back in the 1980s, when the digital revolution was at its beginning, we really had some people which were suggesting, we will have the possibility to get new entries into the business? And some people on the so-called Schumpeter Mark II model said no, because it's more likely that incumbent firms will explore the technological opportunities and then they will be there. At the end, one company managed to be there, and I repeat, I don't understand why it is not in the big tech, IBM. All the other companies did not manage to do that. And now, when some of these big tech companies try to move in technological trajectories which are outside their main line of business, totally outside their main line of business, for example, when Google tried to make the the automobile, the driver, how do you call it? The automobile without driver, self-automatic automobile.
Autonomous, yes.
Autonomous drive. It failed. And it failed because they know very well about the knowledge base to do that, but they don't know enough about how to make cars. And in order to make cars, there are other companies which have got more than 100 years of experience. And therefore, this diverted the strategy and they started to create joint ventures with automobile makers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniele. We have relatively short time left, about 12 minutes before we have to stop at 2 o'clock. Those who would like to ask a question, could you please put your hand up using the little icon on your screen and I'll call you. Can I beg you all to be brief in your questions and responses? So first up, Grazia.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much, both Cecilia and Daniele. I really thought that both talks were very interesting. There is something I would like to add from some work which I've done recently, which is going to be published soon. And it is the following, that in fact, the digital companies are very low on foreign direct investment. Now, we usually actually define multinational companies by their foreign direct investment. So these very multinational companies, the digital ones, are actually low on foreign direct investment. They are low on real assets anyway, because most of their assets are intellectual property assets. But most of those are concentrated in, most of their real assets are concentrated in their country of origin. Now, this is a very important thing because they do get a lot of profits from abroad, from revenue, but that revenue is not based on real fixed investments. This is, in my view, this is an extra argument for the fact that there is this sort of territorial polarization which we are seeing, US versus China, is really very problematic because the other countries actually pay profits, receive a lot of business, have interference in their politics, etc., etc., etc. But in fact, they don't receive that much in terms of fixed investment. So I would really go very much with what Daniele was saying and also supporting Cecilia, that we need really a strong counter element in digital technology within Europe. I mean, even the fact that in terms of tax, payment of tax, which is of course part of this multinational business, I mean, the reason why we have arrived at some kind of agreement is because the US have taken the initiative and they set the bottom line for the corporation tax at 15%, which is not that high, but you know, that's what suits them. And if there is a problem, the US will defend their companies. It is their companies, not the European ones or the rest, let alone the rest of the world. So that's that. I mean, more or less, I think I'll leave it because other people may want to talk. Thank you.
Cecilia, do you want to respond now or would you like to wait and respond at the end?
I think that it's better to wait and respond so that we make sure that everyone can answer. And if we run out of time, it's me and not the others.
I will leave a couple of minutes at the end for you to respond. You're not going to have very much time, I'm afraid. Okay, next up is Catherine.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. I just wondered whether you saw an issue about innovation coming from totally other areas, really. For example, it could be something as trivial in one sense as perhaps chip technology not being available, and that this could be the constraining, organizing, controlling part of digital innovation and ownership of IP. I'd like your response if that's possible. Thank you.
Okay, now I don't have any more hands up at the moment, which is good because it gives Cecilia a chance to respond. But I also want to ask a question myself, which is about, I mean, we have talked about European responses, and the European Commission has introduced two major regulations recently. One is the Digital Services Act, and the other is the Digital Markets Act. And I wondered if you saw them as having any serious impact on this situation that you have outlined. Okay, then you have 5 minutes to respond.
Yeah, so I will just reply like with bullet points. First of all, thanks for the questions. For also thanks Daniele for the comments and for engaging with this discussion. And let me first start with the question about why intellectual monopolies and why we insist that they are monopolies. It's because we conceptualize, as I said very briefly at one point, we don't think of monopolies only as a market structure. Actually, there is a lot of literature also on thinking of monopolies in terms of the concentration of capital, tangible or intangible, as well as also on the concentration of intellectual property rights in particular. And that's what we are referring. And it's relevant. And what they are monopolizing is access to knowledge. So we need to also try to expand our concepts, because it's true that coming from economics, when you say monopoly, everybody thinks one firm operating in one market. But what we are trying to say is, even if they are not just one firm, even if they have more or less market power, think even of Amazon Marketplace, where Amazon is one among the many offering, but still can use its intellectual monopoly to better position itself and profit from the others or profit differentially. So that's basically our aim. What they are monopolizing is global access to knowledge, and it ends up having even more serious consequences, because it's not just one market monopolized, but that knowledge could be used for a wide diversity of applications. The case of IBM is very interesting as well. Let me just say that IBM, and unlike big tech companies, doesn't have original data sources being harvested all the time. And this reinforces the argument of why it's not just about the algorithms, and it's not just about the data. It's both things. And we see this in the cloud. We see how companies either depend on one thing or the other. And a third thing that goes to I do agree absolutely with what Gracia was saying, but just one small clarification. Big tech companies, in particular Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, have tangible assets investments beyond their revenue growth. So the growth in tangible capital investment outpaces growth in revenues. Why I'm saying that these companies are super intangible, and now I say that they're also super tangible? This is because of all the digital infrastructure they concentrate. They concentrate more than 50% of the undersea internet cable. They also concentrate most of the data centers. So this technology package, we need to think of digital technologies as the three things ultimately: data, algorithms, and processing power and capacity to transport data. Then in terms of Europe, let me say that I have recently published a paper with a French and two Argentinian co-authors in Competition and Change on the case of Siemens as a potential illustrative case of what's happening to Europe. Even its leading company in AI patenting depends on the technologies of big tech, and big tech companies are entering the Siemens of business, at least in medical machines. So indeed, there is a need, as Daniele was saying, for alternatives. These alternatives, they should not only be the EU regulating the already existing big tech companies and public big techs from the European Union that try to operate and process the data for the good of the people, and let's say a public search engine that doesn't feed us with advertisement, but actually everyone can access it for free without all the ads, would be amazing to have it. The problem is, and this it's clearer and clearer as we speak, the problem is that there is no technological capacity. And on top of that, there is no political will. But the political will, as long as it can be just covered by the lack of technological capacities, I think, unfortunately, we will not be seeing that type of solution as much as we can envision it and think of it as a possible counterbalancing effect. And then the question about the collaborations between universities and firms, absolutely. And I think that what we should be discussing is what type of collaboration, with whom, what is the goal of the collaboration? So these type of questions need to be asked all the time before automatically accepting a collaboration with a firm. Because in principle, collaborations were supposed to afterwards lead to more innovation that at some point would lead to diffusion and further development of the whole industry. When this second part is not happening, we need to actually rethink about what type of collaborations and with whom. And then, yes, absolutely, finally what Catherine was saying. Oh,
Cecilia, can I interrupt you, because I'm
yes.
I'm passing. We're heading rapidly towards 2 o'clock when
okay,
I get cut off by Microsoft. So let me just say, I'll hand the floor back to you until we're cut off, but thank you very much to you and to Daniele as our speakers, and those who've asked questions and all those who've taken part today. Thank you very much. If you would like to continue until
very briefly, yes, thanks a lot to everyone. And I continue answering just very briefly to Catherine's question. I think that we should be looking closely to the semiconductor industry. It is not a surprise that Apple is developing its own semiconductors and chips, designing them, of course. And these tensions and more balance bargaining power between big tech companies and other intellectual monopolies with companies like TSMC or Samsung as semiconductor providers is something to look at. And at the policy level, it is not a surprise that the US state is so focused on bringing back some productive capacity to the US. So yes, it's I think that what I was describing, focusing on big tech, is actually a global dynamic that includes all the key sectors of the economy. We could also be speaking about similar things in relation to big pharma. And finally, in terms of the regulations from the European Union, I said something very briefly at one point. I think the regulations are too much focused on big tech companies as market gatekeepers and do not advance on these companies I mentioned of knowledge and data and information gatekeepers, and this is a shortfall. In the early drafts, there was no specific analysis about the cloud, and this is essential. I heard from someone that this is being changed as we speak, and the version that they are expecting to finally approve from the Digital Markets Act will have a special chapter for cloud. I'm looking forward to reading it. But yes, just to finish here, I think that although it can contribute to some extent, it's also limited in others. And one word on this, more competition is not always the solution. And in this case, it's not, because these companies operate as in natural monopolies. Search engines, for instance, are a natural monopoly. So we need to think of other alternatives, and the Digital Markets Act, for instance, and Services Act do not consider that. So with this, I think I covered all the questions, and thanks a lot for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for fantastically stimulating and interesting presentation. Thank you, Daniele, for your incisive comments, and thank you to everyone else who's taken part. Marianne, we draw to a conclusion here.
Thank you very much to all three of you and to all the discussants. It's been a really wonderful event, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. So thank you for your time and for coming to meet us at the Centre for Innovation Management Research.
Thank you.
I officially close the event.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's terrific. Thank you, Marianne.